Hello, this is Russell Moore, and you're listening to The Russell Moore Show, brought to you by Christianity Today. Every week, we explore here conversations and questions from a Christian perspective to help you sort out how to live as a follower of Jesus in confusing times. And this week, we have a conversation to seek to do just that. We are coming up on Juneteenth, a relatively new federal holiday, but not a new celebration in the United States of America. And I wanted to talk about that today with Justin Giboney, who is the co-founder of the AND campaign. Many of you are familiar with the AND campaign. And if you're not, check it out. He's an attorney and a political strategist. He lives in Atlanta. And he's also the producer of How I Got Over, a 5-part series that examines the history of 7 historic Black denominations and highlights major Black Christian leaders. And that's something I want to talk about today. Justin Giboney, welcome to the show.
Hey, Dr. Moore, thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
You know, there are some people, I think, who don't quite know what Juneteenth is. They know it's a holiday now, but they don't know actually what they're celebrating. How would you explain it to folks?
I would call it Independence Day, maybe a second Independence Day. Basically, what happened was after the Emancipation Proclamation, while some slaves were told of their freedom in Texas, they were not told. Some say it's because there was a lack of Union soldiers that could tell them what was going on, but they were not told until about 2.5 years later that they were actually free. And so they didn't know, but marking that Juneteenth is basically when slaves in Texas were told that they had been emancipated.
Hmm. And what do you think led to the recognition this long later in terms of a federal holiday where you're seeing Juneteenth celebrated not just in the Black community but beyond?
Initially, it was very big in Texas, obviously, in places like, I believe, Oklahoma and Louisiana. And then it became kind of a bad thing to celebrate it, almost as if it was taking something away from the Fourth of July. Me,
Mhm.
myself, is interesting because I never knew. The only thing I knew was celebrating it. I'm from Denver, Colorado, but oddly enough, we had a pretty big Juneteenth celebration from as early as I can remember. So it's something that I always celebrated. It was interesting when I came to the South to see that people didn't really celebrate it as much, at least when I was in Tennessee and Georgia. And then it became something big. And I think it goes along with a lot of the racial issues we've had as of late, whether it be issues with racial violence and things of that nature. People became a lot more conscious of those issues and the history. And I think people just started pushing to bring that history into the conversation. And I'm glad they did. I'm glad there was pressure on folks to and state legislatures and such to make it a holiday. And I think it's a positive.
I saw one state legislator in, I believe, Texas. Don't hold me to that, but I think it was Texas, debating the recognition of Juneteenth. Who said we shouldn't do that because it's a woke holiday. And of course, we're in this time right now where almost everything is somehow connected to what somebody's going to call wokeness. Why are we in this moment? How
Yeah.
did we get here?
It's a shame that, we want to make certain things insignificant. How could a people who had been uh, enslaved for hundreds of years and they get their freedom, how could we see that as insignificant? I think that's unfortunate. But if I had to guess, the reason is because of an idol we have. And I think we've made an idol out of a romanticized understanding of American history. And so what Juneteenth does is it reminds us of slavery. It reminds us of that sin, and people don't want to bring that back up. We'd rather just look at the things that kind of glorify America. But I'm a true believer. I celebrate the 4th, always have. I
Mhm.
celebrate Juneteenth again, like I said, always have. And so I think it's one way of recognizing the things America has gotten right and also the things that America has gotten wrong. Unfortunately, because of some of our narratives, especially on the right, we don't want to look at those things that it's gotten wrong almost as if they would disappear or people wouldn't pay attention to them if we try to ignore it.
And yet it's really amazing how even with Juneteenth, you have both the historic failures of the United States, moral failures, and also the ideals. These are Americans who are being freed from slavery. This is in an American state. These are American ideals, so they fit together. And yet, it seems like right now, as you said, there's a sense of a wanting to either romanticize everything about the history of the country or to act as though everything there were no real ideals behind anything in this country. And sometimes these are even self-contradictory.
It's all about narrative, and the historic facts don't really all matter all that much. And so if it supports my narrative at that moment to make the America this great country that has never had any flaws, and that's what I run with. At some point I'm saying it went all wrong and we have to go back, I run with that. But if it supports my narrative to put everything on the American system and say that it was awful and has always been awful and hasn't improved, then that's what I do. I wish people would take the stance that I think Frederick Douglass took. This is somebody who was a runaway slave, a former slave who got his freedom later, who basically said even he understood the ideals and how important those ideals were. He would say to other abolitionists, "I will not tear this country apart because even though this country is doing something very wrong, its ideals give us the mechanism to fix it." And that is something that we really have to think about. If Frederick Douglass, who had been through all the things that many of us talk about, can see the value of those ideas and the ideals and the mechanism that it gave us and still gives us to fix things, then I think we should be able to see that too, while recognizing that we have had to call on those ideas or evoke those ideas to get past some tough times and some very serious transgressions.
As we're recording this just a day or two ago, U.S. Senator Tim Scott, presidential candidate, was on, of all places, The View. And there was a discussion that broke out about whether or not Tim Scott is the exception or whether he is the rule. And he tried to make the case that he's not an exception, that things have dramatically changed in the United States when it comes to racial justice and racial progress. Uh, how would you evaluate that?
Yeah, I was just watching that clip, and it's an interesting clip, and he's brave for stepping into that one. But I think he did a fairly good job. One thing I would say is the difference. Let me start with the difference I have. I think for me, Senator Scott sometimes um, I think he underplays the role of systemic injustice. And so I think one way to get at that question would be to say that throughout history there has been things that kept certain people back, and that there's a long way that we have to go, and we need to recognize that. We don't need to downplay. I'm sorry, I said under. We don't need to downplay the fact that we've had some serious issues and still have those issues. And I think sometimes he does that. But what I thought he got at is this, because of the ideas and because of some of the things we're trying to live up to, there has been improvement. And I think to look at American history and not recognize that improvement is a mistake. Now, is he the exception? In a way, he is the exception, right? Because he's obviously a senator and all those things. But can others reach that? I think so. I mean, it's hard to, it's a tough question because it's hard to say that a senator in the position that he's in isn't the exception for almost everybody.
Right, right.
But are those opportunities there for some? I think yeah. Unfortunately, more so for people in a certain class. But I still think that given opportunities and given chances, we need to always be fighting for those. People can make it to that. I think America gives people the opportunity to do that with the help of people who are trying to right certain wrongs.
Yeah, I think that's important because there are it seems to me, two ways that we could go that both end up in the same place. One of those is to say, well, everything's settled and solved, and history works itself out, and we're beyond that. We see where that leads. There's also a sense of we can never have an expectation of movement at all, that even what appears to be progress is really just another power struggle. It seems to me that leads to the exact same place as the first mistake, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think it does lead to it. Again, these are ways, I think both of those are ways of kind of reduce, we're reducing that, we're flattening reality. And what we're trying to
Mhm.
do is make our argument stronger. So if I care about, and a lot of these people may be well intended, if I really care about race, it makes a stronger argument to say we've gone nowhere than to say, actually, here's some progress we made, but we need to go further. If I'm trying to convince someone, to start at the place where we really haven't gotten anything done may give me a stronger argument, or at least a more provocative argument, if that's what people are looking for. But I can't ever say that. I look at people like Fannie Lou Hamer. I look at my
Mhm.
grandparents, folks in the civil rights generation, and see all that they fought for, see all the things that my people have helped build throughout history. And I can't look at that and in good faith say that we haven't made any progress. I mean, when my grandfather was in Tennessee, there's no way he could have gotten into Vanderbilt University. And because of
Mm.
the sacrifices he made, I was able to go there. So I don't see how I can look at that and say the same. And so, yeah, I think we just need to be intellectually honest. And sometimes that makes for an argument that may be a little harder to make, but we need to do that because it's important. And the truth of the matter is, most people on the other side don't believe it when we kind of uh, try to reinforce our arguments in that way anyway.
You mentioned Fannie Lou Hamer, my fellow Mississippian, and I can't help but think about the way, and you've talked about this several times before, and including in this 5-part series, How I Got Over, about the centrality of the Black church specifically in terms of the civil rights movement, in terms of every movement preceding it. I wonder, what is the state right now of the Black church in your view?
Yeah, I think it's in flux to some extent. I mean, there is no. Let me first say this: there is still no stronger institution in the Black community. For instance, and we note this in the docu series. There's no institution that has done for as much for African Americans in education, not even close, as the African American church. Whether it's creating universities and things of that nature, or even smaller schools or church schools. It's always been there to do that. It still does a lot. It's still feeding a lot of people every day. But I think people need to, we need to decide: are we going to maintain it as that staple like it has been? And so there's a lot of strength there. But I think my generation and generations coming behind me too are saying, how do we improve what needs to be improved about the Black church, but also try to make sure that it is what it always has been, which is the center of our economics, which is the center of our community. And I think that's important to move forward with. Folks like Dr. Charlie Dates are very serious about that as well. And we have those conversations. And I think while it's in flux in some ways, it's still more powerful than any other institution that we have in our community.
I wonder if you would agree with, I was talking a couple of weeks ago with someone who works specifically in apologetics and specifically in Black communities. And he said that people aren't paying attention to the rise of atheism in the Black community because people think atheist and they think Norway, Sweden, and when they think about African American life in the United States, they think immediately of the Black church and ways that, for instance, religious communities are important in the political structure of the country. But he said that he's encountering, especially among a lot of young Black men, the exact same sort of secularization, and in his experience, maybe even a little more than you would find, elsewhere. Have you seen that, or is this unique to this person?
I think there is a trend. I mean, you'll run into that a lot more than you did back when I remember growing up. Obviously, everyone was not Christian, but I
Mhm.
think people recognize just the strong role that the Black church played. So even if you were unsure, right? Even if you were saying, there's some things I'm not sure about with the church. Rarely did you go to atheism, because there
Mhm.
was something, I believe there was something about our struggle and the way that we got through that made it hard to say there wasn't a God. And you had moments where you had Black Muslim movements and things like that that came out of the Black Power movement. In some ways, started some of that, some of the atheism that you might see. But even then, it wasn't a majority, and maybe not to where it has reached now. So it is an issue that we have to address. I think as you become more secular, as you go into secular institutions, that's something that's happened, and I think we see it happening not just with the Black church, but a lot of people in a lot of different areas. But I also think as we move forward, people see that failing them as well, and so there's an
Mhm.
opportunity to reach back in and evangelize and bring people back into the church.
Why are you a Christian?
I'm a Christian because of what God has done for me. I mean, Jesus. I mean, if I look, obviously in my own life, but just through history, um, and you look at something like the Exodus narrative and the way the role that it's played in the Black church, I cannot deny the experience and what God has brought me through. Living a life, growing up in a household with an alcoholic father, seeing him, lean on God, lean on Jesus, and get through. Those are the type of things that have meant a lot to me. And you don't have a Black church, you don't have us overcoming in the way that we did without our faith. In
Mm.
fact, there are atheists who have had to admit that it was the faith of the Black church that pulled them through slavery in the way that it did. I mean, it's just an undeniable thing. And so for me, certainly the foundation was laid through my grandfather, who was a bishop in the Church of Living God, and others. But my own experience with Jesus pulling me through, whether it be racial issues or whether it be issues of my own making, is just an undeniable experience that I've had, and one that I want to share for sure.
You mentioned an alcoholic father, and it made me think of the fact that often the places where I see the most confidence in terms of bearing witness to the gospel, and the places where I see the most evangelism are with recovering addicts
Mhm.
to some form of substance. And as I think about it, in almost every case, every church I've ever served, the one who was organizing everybody and reminding everybody we need to be out sharing the gospel, recovering alcoholic or drug addict or something along those lines. Why do you suppose that is?
I think it's because they're brought to their knees and made to understand that they can't do it on their own.
Mm,
In so many other instances, we can kind of rationalize, well, I did this myself and brought myself out. When you're addicted and you've been addicted for a while and you've tried to overcome it and you can't do it, and then you realize that my faith can get me through it, and you see it get you through. It's an undeniable testimony that I think they can see very clearly, that sometimes those of us who haven't been through that situation have a harder time saying, that we are self-reliant in that way. I mean, that we are reliant, not self-reliant in that way.
I think that's exactly right. Justin, you co-founded the AND campaign. And of course, what AND means there is that we shouldn't be separating things that are supposed to go together, including the moral order and social justice, both. Don't choose one, both. Uh, where do you think that conversation is right now in American life? Are we getting
Well,
more toward an and, or are we getting more toward an or?
I would like to say we're all getting closer to but it really depends on who you speak to. I think in the public square, when we look at the Christian witness in general, there's a lot more or than there is and.
Mm.
When I talk to people, they may see the importance of social justice, but may not realize that it's actually the truth and moral order that even allows you to have a social justice, that allows you to say, I'm calling you to be just, which means that I'm setting an unconditional standard that we all have to abide by. And sometimes I think we miss that. On the other side, people talk about morality, they talk about the truth, but don't necessarily always consider um, the compassion side of it. And one thing about the AND campaign, our framework is not something that we made up, it's something that we kind of re articulated. And so what I see a lot of times is that a lot of Christians catch on to it very quickly because that's what they were thinking. They just needed to hear it articulated. And so there are a lot of people, especially young Christians, as we go to Christian colleges and universities, that say, I can engage in social justice and be orthodox. I don't have to give up my biblical values to care about people. I do see folks catching on to that and really appreciating that articulation. But I really want to get you to hear the fact that there's something missing on both sides, and the gospel has the answer for that. And we need to understand the brilliance and how it surpasses progressivism and conservatism.
I was just not too long ago talking to some congressional staffers, and I had one Democratic staffer who came up and kind of whispered and said, "I'm a Christian. It's really hard because I'm able to really do all the things that I think I ought to do in my particular area when it comes to sort of public justice, but I can't really talk about the personal aspect of it very much." Yeah, I was talking to a Republican staffer who said essentially almost the exact reverse of that. That he could talk all day long about his personal morality, his personal following of Christ, but he sure couldn't start to apply it to issues of public justice. Uh, for both of those people, and I think that reflects a lot of pastors, a lot of leaders. They have a tribe around them where they can talk about one of those things and get applause. But if they talk about the other, they're going to get trouble. How do they navigate that, do you think?
Well, I don't know that I have anything that makes it easy on them, but I think part of it is just understanding your obligation to do it.
Mm,
And if you're talking about being around other Christians, then you got to go to the Bible. And so if I'm on the right, then I got to go to the book of Amos and say, what do we mean we're not supposed to talk about systems? That's exactly what Amos does, right? He goes
yeah.
and says that you are partial, your courts are partial. Well, that the courts, that's a system, right? That look at how you're treating the poor, and really in a systemic way. And so we have to bring that up. But the other part is when we talking to people on the left, Jesus loved, but Jesus did not coddle. And so Jesus was very upfront about what people had to change within themselves. We see it in John 5, we see it in John 8, sin no more, get up, but don't, you can't, he tells a man that you cannot no longer sin. There was something internal, right? That couldn't just be cured through other people. It was inside of you. And I think we just have to have a real conversation with people to say, look, let's look historic examples, are often helpful. But we have to be honest with other people and say, let me challenge you, especially if we're using the Bible for this. Let me challenge you to show you where Jesus actually is very much talking about personal transformation and how that has to come along with it. And the truth of the matter is, we should all know that people are creating systems. So if the system's broken, it's probably likely that it's broken people that created it, and that kind of goes both ways.
How do you know if you're in a system? And I'm not talking about sort of virtually unchangeable systems like the United States of America. But
Mhm.
if you're in a system, maybe it's a workplace, maybe it's a nonprofit, maybe it's a church. How do you know when what you're dealing with is something that just needs to be repaired and when there's a system that just isn't repairable and something new needs to be created?
Wow, that's interesting. I think that's a really good question. And I think it depends on the foundation, right? And so there are certain things like the ideals of America. Is the foundation and the principles that we're working with, can they be used to make things better? And are the people that are running the system open to hearing that? In a place like America, just like I said with Frederick Douglass, as bad as it was, he saw through that to the ideals. Or am I in a situation where the principles that we're working off of aren't even right? So even if we call people back to, let's get back to what really got us here. What are the fundamentals? When those fundamentals are gone, and and people aren't even striving towards that ideal, then sometimes there needs to be a bigger change, a bigger something bigger than just a small reform. But the other part that I think we have to do in those situations is talk to other people and see what they're experiencing. So you may be in a let's I mean, church is a good way to talk about this, right? So I may be in a church where people are getting things wrong just with what the Bible says, right? And so there's not even a commitment to a true biblical interpretation. Well, at that point, I might have to go, and there's time, either something massive has to change or I have to go. But if people can see the principles at times, and you are able to kind of explain it, even if it takes time, that may be worth staying and seeing through some reform. I don't know if there's a quick way to know exactly when that change comes. I think it comes with a lot of prayer. I think you have to have conversations with others. But it can, I can see how it can go wrong either way. You don't want to stay too long in a situation that's bad. But often what I see sometimes too is people giving up too quickly,
Yeah.
instead of taking some type of ownership and saying, hey, it's not only me, it's the people coming up through here after me that need a change. Sometimes we just give up too quickly. And so I think prayer is the number one way to do it. I don't think there's a quick and easy answer, but we really have to look to the principles and how people are abiding by those principles or even attempting to.
You know, one of the things that you do, not all of it, but one of the things you do is advocacy. And before you came into the role you're in right now, you were in politics. You were working in American government. One of the questions I get a lot on college campuses from young Christians, sometimes even from high school age Christians, is how do how does a person know if he or she should go into politics? And the reason I think that so many of them are asking this, I mean, I think it's a good question at any time, but particularly right now, I think these young Christians are seeing, maybe especially explicitly, the ways that politics can absolutely destroy a soul, and they don't want that. So, how would you advise somebody to figure out whether or not politics is the way to go or if they should stay away from it?
A lot of politics is about opportunity. And so sometimes if an opportunity arises and you really think um, that you're prepared for it, then that's something you can look into. One thing I always say is no one else can tell you to run. So you can't run just because somebody else said it's a good idea. You got to take that long walk and decide for yourself. And so even as people ask me, I say, I can't answer that for you because I've been wrong. I've told people that race, I don't know if you can win it and they've won it, or I've told people that they should do it and they get have a really hard time. But I think one is the opportunity in front of you. Are you passionate about a certain issue? And within that passion uh, for making change, are there opportunities for you to go forward with that? And sometimes you just have a really deep passion for something and you can't look away. And sometimes there's an issue that you see and you say, I've got to do and say something about that. Now, the only politics isn't the only way to do that. So that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be a politician. You could run your local neighborhood organization, or you could be somebody who's in business who actually now has the influence to have an impact on that or give. And so I think you have to look at the issue, that if there's issues that you really care about, and the opportunity to pursue it. Now, sometimes the opportunity is not right there in front of you. If you're really serious about running for office, you should be willing to spend the time to, get to know your community, to maybe work on some campaigns, to work on certain issues, go to city council, understand how things work. And then as time goes on, maybe something arises for you. So I don't want to give the impression that unless it's obvious that you can win right now, don't do it. You should be willing to spend that time. And if you're willing to spend that time and the opportunity arises and you have a passion, then you should do it because somebody has to. And we can't be afraid to enter into that conversation just because we may get beat up a little bit. Well, anytime anybody changed anything, they took some shots. And so if you're willing to take the shots, if you're willing to put some time into it and the opportunity arises, then I say go for it if you have that passion. And again, you can't look away. But make sure you're doing it for the right reasons, that it's not about position, it's not about power, it's not about how people look at you, but it really is about those issues and representing people who wouldn't have the same voice without you.
And sometimes it's not that at the first, but it becomes it. I think we've both seen people who started out in a political arena one way, but then ambition, those things start to pull them in ways that they can't handle. How did you live through the political system without becoming a hack or without sort of surrendering to whatever it takes ambition.
Yeah, my story is kind of the opposite. I kind of
Mm.
I kind of
Mhm.
went in as a hack,
Oh,
and that
okay.
and that doesn't mean that I didn't have any passion for things. I wanted to change things, but I did
Yeah.
go in doing it because I like, I was a former football player. I liked the competition. I thought it was fun. I enjoy politics and the issues, but I can't say it was for like a faith based reason. And so
Mhm.
what happened to me is I kind of went in saying I'll do whatever I got to do to get to kind of come up in the system. And then as my as I was convicted in that, as time went on, I said, you know what, I really have to reconnect my faith to this because it has to mean more. And I'll be honest with you, the reason that happened is during a campaign we ran against somebody. We were really, really hard on her, and I had a hand in that. And I remember seeing her after it was over, and her saying, and I said, "Oh, good to see you." Thinking it was, it's all over, we're okay. And she said, "Well, I'm doing a lot better now that you're off my back." And I could
Mm.
just almost see tears in her eyes, and I realized this was a person that I just kind of said anything that needed to be said about to win. And I
Yeah.
think that started to change me a little bit. But I do agree with you. Some people come in. I mean, anybody who reads political biographies know that some people come in wanting to do everything the right way, and it takes longer sometimes doing it that way. Or they're hit so many times that they just change, or the money gets to them, influences. There are a lot of different ways that it can happen, and they end up being somebody they never thought they would be. And in a lot of cases, the higher you get up, the more that happens.
Mhm.
My story was a little different. Obviously, I'm not in high office right now, but I really had to turn the other way, away from coming in thinking, "Oh, this is just a game. Let's get as much power as we can get."
Well, and that's a temptation now for, almost everybody in an era of social media. It becomes really difficult to remind yourself that you're interacting with a person, not with just an avatar. And so isn't that the case that it's just some of those temptations that would have only emerged in very specific contexts before, just technologically, now it's open immediately for everybody, and it doesn't seem like that's getting any better.
No, I don't think it's getting any better. I mean, it's so easy nowadays because of social media to turn other people into political abstractions.
Yeah,
Just kind of pawns on some type of chessboard, instead of understanding that everybody has a testimony, right? And so, I mean, how many times do we see people on social media talk about whole groups of people and really just put them in one box and say they're all the same way and that they all have the same motivations? And it's really hard to do that when you know people. And one thing that I'm thankful for, growing up in Denver, Colorado, having a very diverse background, it is harder for me to take a whole group of people and say they're one way, because I would have to deny many of the experiences that I've had. I've seen kids who had all the money they wanted in the world, and their parents didn't pay any attention to them, right? I mean, that I would never trade places with. So I think relationship is missing because we don't really have to interact and relate. We can say whatever we want to say and do it anonymously and not really be held accountable in the same way, and then get patted on the back from our tribe. And
yeah.
it's really going to take people to say, no, that's not, we can't treat people in that way. We have to hear them out. And even if we disagree, do we know the good that they're trying to get to, even if their conclusion's wrong? And we just don't take the time to do that, and really aren't forced to do that in any way, especially with social media.
One of the really contentious issues in American life right now, and church life too, is sexuality, gender identity. Do you think that do you think that we're at a place where the culture wars around those issues, LGBTQ issues, and the historic witness of the church, are we starting to get to a place where we really can do that well, where you can have people in the public space who disagree, but who are able to see each other as human beings and talk to one another? Or is that getting worse in your view?
Um, I see people who are doing it well. I think I see people who are doing it a lot better than I might have said in the mid '90s. Right?
Mm,
I see Christians who are saying, "Hey, I maintain my biblical values, but we got this compassion thing really wrong.
Mhm.
But at the same time, I see a lot of cancel culture. I see people saying, "Hey, either you say it exactly the way we want to and emphasize what we want to emphasize, whether it's the love or the truth, or just shut up."
Mm.
And so I think I think it's in flux. I mean, it could go different ways. I think it's not at the height of cancel culture. I think in some ways you can say some of the things that maybe you couldn't say before, but at the same time, it's still a lot of people with power and influence who are really trying to silence the debate. Who really make it difficult to go in. You know, we see these at law schools of all places where people are getting shouted down for their opinions on those issues. So I'm hopeful because I do see Christians that are talking about it in a better way, that are combining that compassion and conviction like you might not have seen before, but we still have a ways to go. And I'm not exactly sure where it's going to turn because it seems like it could go either way.
Well, and the shouting down of people at law schools and at other places, survey data show us this, that there is a pull to illiberalism both on the left and the right. And the younger you go, the more that that's the case, where you have people who will say, no, speech that I disagree with is harmful speech and should not be allowed to happen. Uh, how do we get around that? I mean, how do we encourage a next generation to have the right kind of pluralism in the public square where we disagree but we don't coerce each other, without having the kind of pluralism that says, well, everything ultimately is all the same.
Yeah, I mean, on your first point, it's interesting because when they talk about young people, I often wonder which young people they're talking about.
Hmm.
Because if you're talking about folks at certain schools in higher education, yes, they seem to be very illiberal and very comfortable with that. When I talk to some of, the younger people that I know that may not be in college or maybe, going to like a Georgia State or something like that, I don't always see that. So it is interesting. I don't know how large that group is. And I think even if some people fiddle around with it a little bit, they're not as far gone as it may seem as when we see like folks in those areas. Um, so that's one way to think about it. But I think the answer at the end of the day is, civic pluralism. Our friend John Anazu, called it confident pluralism. We have to have a real understanding that we live in a pluralistic society. People are going to have ideas that we disagree with, and they have the right to have ideas that we disagree with. And if we're going to change their mind, it's not through compulsion. We change their mind through persuasion. And so I don't need a situation where Christians are given some type of assumption or we're given a leg up or some kind of a competitive advantage on convincing people of what we think is right or wrong. That's not how it should be in this type of society. But at the same time, I'm confident in what I believe, right? And I say there is a truth. I need to stand up for that truth, regardless of what the threats are, regardless of what may come at me. I need to stand up for that. And what I don't think Christians get in a lot of cases, because we don't take that stance. People complain about it, but if one by one people take that stance, I think courage is something that really spreads quickly. And when people start taking a stance and standing on it, others will follow. But even in taking those stances, it's not about the triumphalism. It's not about being strident. It's really about talking to people in a way that that they know that you love them, and that's why you may have those disagreements, and letting them know even if we do disagree, I love you, and I'll still do as much as I can to make sure that you're safe, to make sure that you're not taken advantage of or exploited.
How do you, in your own life, stay close to Jesus? Are there particular spiritual practices that you have found work better for you?
Yeah, I mean, one of the disciplines that I try to use, and believe me, I could do better. But I do try to every night pray for people that I have an issue with, that say things that I don't like, or people that I could end up having a rivalry with. Um, I think that's very important. And not just praying that they agree with me.
Right.
the next time we disagree,
Right.
but saying, I want them to flourish and I want God to work in their lives. And where I'm wrong or where I'm being petty, please hold me accountable for that too. But I don't know that anything is more than just my church family. My Sunday school family keeps me grounded. They keep me motivated at times, and you know how this can get this back and forth in this dialogue and the way that people come at you can be discouraging at times. But I think being in the church that I am, still having saints around that were around during the civil rights movement, it just reminds me that there's people that went through much more than I did, and it keeps me going, and it keeps me wanting to hold on, and certainly wanting to make sure that I represent them well and represent obviously Jesus well in the public square, which means to me means standing on Scripture and but also making sure that I'm compassionate and trying to understand others.
We're coming up on Juneteenth. We're coming up on 4th of July. We're coming up on several holidays that mark civic space, not part of the liturgical calendar, the church calendar of anybody's liturgy. How do you think the church ought to interact with those sorts of civic observations? Should we have services that are built around them? Should we acknowledge them? Should we? I mean, there are a lot of, especially when it comes to 4th of July, for a long time, there have been churches that have thought, what do we do when it comes to this without sort of merging the sacred with the state? How would you handle that?
Yeah, I don't see a problem with acknowledging it, but I think I would stop short of putting the American flag around the pulpit or something like that. I think we can look and say in something like Juneteenth, we do see God working. If you ask my elders and the folks, and the folks who went through those periods, they truly believe that that was God responding to a prayer. This wasn't some thing where they thought they accomplished it. Just like somebody who had to admit that they weren't self-reliant, they were forced to know that they weren't self-reliant. And so when you saw those changes, you knew that it was God interacting and engaging. And so I think we can recognize that. I mean, I've given sermons where I mentioned 4th of July, and you can connect it to certain other certain things. But we want to be careful that we're not uplifting the country in a way in more than it really should be. We want to make sure that we're not romanticizing history. So we can give some of the history. We can be godly proud of certain things that we've accomplished, but also willing to say that shouldn't go into a sort of supremacy or nationalism. That is just us realizing how God has worked through us and obviously can work through other people.
What's something in your life that's life-giving for you right now?
Life giving for me. Always my sons. I mean,
Yeah.
that's another thing that just helps me. I have three young sons, and just being a coach for them, being able to coach kids who may not have a father in their life, and seeing how they respond to a man who's consistent and who cares about them, but who's also going to discipline them. I mean, that there's a lot that comes from that too. So I think my sons do a lot for me, and I got to thank my friend Danny Warfel for this. But I've gotten into pickleball too, so that has
Oh, you
been
have?
yeah, that's something new for me that I'm starting to really enjoy.
How can folks find you if they're interested in following your work?
So you can find me on the Church Politics podcast, and so you can get that on iTunes or Spotify. You can also catch the AND campaign on social media at AND campaign on Instagram and Twitter, and then myself at Justin E Giboney Giboney on Instagram and Twitter as well.
All right. Justin Giboney, co-founder of the AND campaign. Thanks for being with us today.
Thanks for having me, Dr. Moore.
I have a new book coming out on August the 1st of this year. It's called Losing Our Religion, an altar call for evangelical America. And really what this book is about is how to navigate the craziness that we're all facing right now. How do we get to the point of exhaustion that so many people are facing? Why are so many people leaving the church? Not because they can't believe what the church teaches, but because they don't believe the church believes what the church teaches. How can evangelical Christianity ever turn around? What would that look like, and how do we get there? That's what this book is about, and you can pre-order it in the show notes, and I look forward to sharing it with you August 1st. Thanks for listening. Links are always in the show notes for resources mentioned in this episode, including a link about how you can have a trial membership to Christianity Today. Be sure to subscribe to the program, send an episode along to a friend who might benefit from it, and leave us a review when you can. It helps other people to find the show wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Russell Moore, and this is The Russell Moore Show from Christianity Today.
The Russell Moore Show is a production of Christianity Today. Executive producers are Eric Petrick, Russell Moore, and Mike Cosper. Hosted by Russell Moore, produced by Ashley Hales, associate producers Abby Perry and Azrae Phelps, CT administration provided by Christine Kolb, social media by Kate Lucky, director of operations for CT Media is Matt Stevens, production assistance provided by Core Media. Audio engineer is Kevin Duthu. Coordinator is Beth Grabencourt. Video producer is John Rowland. The theme song for The Russell Moore Show is Dusty Delta Day by Lennon Hutton.